Well, good Wednesday morning and welcome in. I'm Keitha Nelson. You're watching First Coast News' online coverage of the trial, the murder trial of three men right now. They are accused in the shooting death of Ahmaud Arbery. Again, this is out in Brunswick, Georgia. Ahmaud, we know, was shot and killed back in February of 2020. Right now, folks, we are going into day 9 of testimony. Today, we are expecting to hear from the defense. They will be calling their witnesses. Just yesterday on Tuesday, the state has rested its case. Now, if you are joining us, you perhaps were on just a little bit earlier. What you were watching was the Better Together Coalition and the Glynn Clergy for Equity. Both groups out there in Glynn County coming together, pretty much praying over this trial, which they have been doing throughout the duration for about 5 weeks right now, trying to set the tone again for peace. We know tomorrow we are expecting a large crowd out there in front of the Glynn County Courthouse, including some very big names such as the civil rights leader Jesse Jackson, the Reverend Al Sharpton, Lee Merritt, some well-known attorneys as well, Benjamin Crump. We're going to get to that in just a bit. First, though, I want to welcome in First Coast News, and I hate giving you a title, I really do, because you do so much, but we're going to call you an executive producer for this one. Ann Schindler, who has been involved in this trial, for the case rather, from the very beginning since last year when Ahmaud Arbery was shot and killed. And you were actually inside of the courtroom as one of the very few reporters inside of the actual courtroom, seeing what was going on firsthand just last week. So we're going to fast forward now to where we are in this case. Again, today's a very big day. We are finally going to hear from the defense's witnesses, their side of things. Fill us in again on what we can do, what we can expect today. Let's take a quick look ahead.
So they're not going to get rolling with the jury until 10 o'clock. And the first thing that's going to happen is a little unusual for me in my court experience. I guess it's not entirely uncommon, but the defense attorney for William Roddy Bryan reserved his opening statements, said he wanted to do them after the state presented its case in chief, essentially after they rested. Mm-hmm. And so while we got opening statements from the two other defendants, Greg and Travis McMichael, we still have not heard from Kevin Goff. And of course, we've heard a lot from Kevin Goff this week. He's made a number of national headlines since Friday, but he's going to be getting up and doing his presentation, his formal explanation to the jury as to the facts that he will introduce during the case and basically what he attempts to prove. And so after that happens, then we will start to get into witnesses. The judge said he was going to ask the attorneys whether they were going to call their own clients to testify. And so we may well find that out this morning as well.
That is something that a lot of people are interested in finding out as well, because we do know we've heard from Wanda Cooper Jones, Ahmaud Arbery's mother, who has said she is hopeful that Gregory McMichael in particular will take the stand. She wants to hear from him as a father. We saw the video. We know how Gregory was consoling Travis, his son, following the shooting. She wants to hear from him about how he could have possibly allowed this to happen. So that should be interesting to see if either Gregory, Travis, or William will take the stand again in their own defense. The defense right now is self-defense. Let's get into what we can with that and what you know in terms of what we can expect from the defense and their line of questioning.
Well, in terms of calling their own clients, typically as a rule of thumb, defense attorneys do not call their own clients because then they can be cross-examined. And often that is a withering and terrible experience. They're not professionals. And so while they can answer questions that are directed by their own attorneys just fine, once it gets into cross-examination, it usually doesn't end well. The other thing is, in this case, I believe that the problem for someone like Travis McMichael is if he gets up and they start introducing character testimony about how he's a loving father and he's this and that, it opens the door to the comments that he allegedly made and comments that he also allegedly made on social media, but that he allegedly made over the body of Ahmaud Arbery, which was a racial slur, and all kinds of other character testimony. So it could complicate things, and it may in fact prove prohibitive for him just because that other evidence out there, which has not yet come into the case, could come into the case. So that's one consideration.
You know, there's a lot happening outside of the courthouse as well. Today, this morning, earlier, we just saw a group, two groups, either the Better Together Coalition as well as the Glynn Clergy for Equity, both large groups. We know of several clergymen within the Glynn County area coming together, praying over this trial, which they have been doing since the very beginning. So we're seeing a lot of people coming out. Tomorrow, we want to look ahead and talk about that because we do know that there was a call for 100 black pastors to converge there on the Glenn County courthouse, the steps there. Tomorrow, they're expecting to do a prayer vigil at 11 as well as a march at 3. So again, we're expecting some pretty well-known names to gather there in Glenn County. What can you tell us about that?
Well, it's interesting the presence of black pastors, which has been made an issue by the attorney for Roddy Bryan, is interesting because this whole presence outside the courtroom really has been dominated by people of faith. A lot of them are local. We've had Brunswick pastors stage a tent there almost since the beginning, just to provide chips and water and Band-Aids and just kind of be there as a resource. Now, of course, we're seeing much more higher profile pastors. But again, we're talking about, Jesse Jackson, who's an octogenarian, Al Sharpton, who's up there himself. So we're talking about well-respected elder members of the pastoral community, by nature a very peaceful contingent of people. And I think any city in America would be happy to have that constitute the foundation of their quote unquote protest element. So, it's been largely peaceful. And I think that there's some concern that the comments of the defense attorney might be inciting to a less, that it might be speaking to, kind of a white protest element, perhaps, that he might be using some of those words and some of those phrases that elicit counter protesters or animate them somehow. And so I think that the judge really tried to communicate that with him, saying, I don't know what you're getting at. I mean, he essentially said that to him. He called his comments reprehensible and said, I don't know what you're trying to accomplish here, but it seems to me that you're trying to speak to something outside what this court is doing. And so I don't know if he's going to tone down his rhetoric, but again, the pastors have been, obviously peaceful. It's, kind of what they do, and supportive of the family. And Jesse Jackson has shown that he's going to be there regardless of efforts to throw him out of the courtroom by that attorney. He's going to be there. He was there again yesterday, and he's going to be in town throughout the week.
And let's go back inside the courtroom and talk about some of the things we learned yesterday. Another really emotional day in the courtroom. I mean, the testimony, the images we saw, these photos were just so graphic, because we're talking about this young man, 25 years old, Ahmaud Arbery, losing his life, and we learned some very graphic details. We also heard from the medical examiner just yesterday, who actually examined Ahmaud Arbery's body, and he testified, and the jurors were shown as well, the autopsy photos. He said that Arbery was hit by 2 of the 3 gunshot rounds fired at him, and that either of those shots alone would have killed him. And as a mother, you think, what is going on in the mind of Wanda Cooper Jones sitting back there hearing this? Because we did also hear the medical examiner say that there's nothing that could have been done to save her son's life at that point. That was something that was brought into question when there was an investigator on the stand just last week. One of the first the officers who responded to the scene, the question was, well, why didn't he render aid? Which was cleared up. But we found out again yesterday that it didn't matter what he would have done, because unfortunately, Arbery would have lost his life regardless from either one of those gunshot wounds that hit him.
Yeah, that was, I think, an important piece of testimony, just in terms of that narrative, because it always has been concerning, I think, to people that the first officer on scene showed up and didn't render aid. But yeah, this medical examiner had a pretty powerful line about that, basically that they couldn't have saved him as long as his heart was beating, because he was essentially bleeding out. He had an arterial injury in his wrist, and then basically, the gunshot wounds that exited his back were just essentially fatal, regardless of how aid could have been rendered. But yeah, I mean, for Wanda Cooper Jones, she's shown amazing strength, I think, being present in the courtroom through some of that. The testimony of the autopsy was, very difficult. They're showing him come in and in a body bag, and then kind of, after he's been cleaned up, they're doing these very, very close on examinations of pellets that remain under his skin. It is difficult. And of course, all the clothes he wore, which are sort of laid out and displayed in photographs. So, the jury has seen a lot when it comes to graphic imagery. And, we kind of forget that they're just ordinary folks off the street. I mean, unlike people in the criminal justice system who are very accustomed to those kind of images, they are very shocking for ordinary people. So they paid close attention when that testimony was happening.
And we want to clarify things for folks who are watching, who have not perhaps been watching since the very beginning. So you're going to hear today from, or you're set to hear from Kevin Goff. Now, he is the attorney of William Bryan. He is the neighbor in this case who actually had cell phone video of the killing of Ahmaud Arbery. Now, Kevin is going to be giving his opening statements. You may be wondering, opening statements, how's that possible? The state just rested. Well, this is something that was made as a request weeks ago at the very beginning. He said that he did not want to give an opening statement following the state or the defense's opening statements. He wanted to wait until the state rested. The judge granted that request, and that is why we are again set to hear from him today. So we do want to clarify that if folks are just now will be watching later on today. And if you can as well, let people know about what's set to happen at 10 o'clock, because we're not going to get right into things this morning.
That's right. So at 10 o'clock, we expect Kevin Goff, who is the defense attorney for one of the three men, William Roddy Bryan, the one who filmed the incident or the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, is going to present his case. Typically what attorneys like to do is stand up before any evidence is presented and say, this is what you're going to learn. This is the evidence that you're going to hear. And then, of course, at the end, they do their closing arguments to say, this is what you heard and this is what it proved. He chose not to do that. Now, he is in a better position than perhaps somebody who has just a single client, a single defendant has, because he had two other very, very skillful attorneys get up and do opening. Right. And so he was able to rely on the fact that they presented a lot of compelling argument or statements, and then reserving his time so that he can rebut some of what he's already heard the state say in his opening. So he can attack directly what he heard the state present as evidence in his opening statement and sort of have a fresh attack, if you will, on what we've heard and kind of get his say in. So we'll see. He is an interesting attorney, and I don't know if his manner is always effective. He tends to he elicits a lot of reaction, both from the judge and from the people he's questioning. Yesterday he was questioning the GBI agent, Richard Dial, and questioning him about the video that William Roddy Bryan took, suggesting that maybe when he took it and was driving, that maybe he wasn't pursuing Arbery, maybe he was just going home. And that generated such a reaction from the GBI agent. It was kind of hard to ignore. He's making these faces. It's just like, this is kind of absurd. So I don't know how he reads to the jury. We'll just have to see how his opening statements goes.
That's just very true. We did see that video. And by the way, Kaylee Tracy, Renata DiGregorio, and Schindler all detailing this. You can get some very interesting insight into what's going on Twitter. Follow all of them on Twitter, because you're going to find out pretty much they're live tweeting, letting you know what's going on moment by moment. You mentioned that GBI agent's reaction. Renata tweeted it. And if you look at it, you kind of look at his face, and he is looking the way that we are feeling, kind of like, are we really hearing this? Is that an actual argument that you can expect? Which is why it's so interesting to see what's about to happen with the defense as they start to bring witnesses to the stand. What are we going to hear? What is the actual defense? So what are you hearing about that and looking forward?
Well, the attorneys have been very close to the vest on that. I mean, we've asked several times who they're going to call, kind of what their witness lineup is. And the short answer is I just don't know. They have been advancing a theory that involves, neighborhood under siege. And so I would say, the number of people that we're going to hear from will include some of those neighbors who were concerned about repeated reports of a suspicious person, burglaries that had happened, or, burglaries in the sense of someone being, trespassing or being on a property, which by law is considered a burglary. So I believe that we're going to be hearing from people that had expressed those concerns, that were posting pictures of Ahmaud Arbery on that property on those prior occasions when he was in that home under construction, and then had just generally, expressed concerns. There was a couple of other neighbors in the context of one or more of these appearances by Ahmaud Arbery, where they armed themselves. So I think they're going to use that to show that what happened with Travis McMichael and Greg McMichael wasn't so separate and distinct, that there was a sense of alarm that people were responding to, and they were fearful, and they were, approaching this suspected intruder with arms. And so, the idea that these two gentlemen were somehow acting out of step with norm, and again, that's really what the jury has to decide, is not the facts of the case so much as was their action appropriate? Did they respond in a way that a reasonable person would in that situation? And so it's a determination that they have to make. And the more that the defense can contextualize how they acted as in keeping with how the other neighbors reacted, that's going to strengthen that argument.
Well, folks, if you're just now tuning in right now at 9 a.m., you are watching First Coast News' online coverage of the trial of 3 men accused of murder in the shooting death of Ahmaud Arbery there in Brunswick, Georgia. Now, I have does it look like they're about to start? Mindy, okay, right now, it looks like, okay. So we're just going to continue to talk to Ann until it looks like they're going to take over in the courtroom. So Ann Schindler on the line with us now with First Coast News. And I want to ask you about the timeline, because initially we were hearing they wanted to wrap this up before Thanksgiving. Now we are hearing there could be a motion by the defense requesting more time. They possibly want to do their closing after Thanksgiving. So let's delve into that briefly.
Yeah, so I'll tell you, there was kind of a collective groan, I think, from everybody, from media to family to the jurors probably don't know it yet. But they have been, I think, forewarned that this could go longer. Initially when they did jury selection, they only cleared this jury until the 19th. Right? They asked, are you available till tomorrow?
Right.
And now that it's stretched on, they've had to get commitments of some kind. I spoke to one of the defense attorneys who said, yes, we've gotten that settled. It wasn't clear to me how they approached jurors. They did not do it in open court, but somehow they communicated to them that this case might run long. It might go past the deadline that they'd originally set. And what the defense counsel now want to ask the judge is to move if they're going to have opening statements next week, or excuse me, they're going to have closing arguments next week. They want to have that wrapped in with the deliberative process, and they don't want to hurry this jury a couple days before Thanksgiving. And so I think the ask that they're hoping to make is, look, let's not start our, closing arguments, which are going to take hours and hours. Well, each defendant is going to get a couple hours. The prosecutor is going to get a couple hours. Don't quote me exactly, but they're each getting multiple hours to present. And then send them off to start deliberating, the day before the holiday. They want to do it all the next week. And so we'll have to see what the judge says. I don't think he's very keen on pushing this further down the calendar, but he may ultimately, it'll be interesting to see what the state has to say about that. They also don't want a rushed verdict. So we'll just have to see. But yeah, it's running obviously a lot longer. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that so much of what's happening in this case has happened, in these conversations that we're having outside of the presence of the jury.
That's important to note as well, because we spoke about this yesterday, as a matter of fact, with Renato DiGregorio, First Coast News reporter, because we saw a lot of back and forth between the judge, the state, the defense, and you're wondering, how is the jury actually in the room absorbing all of this? How are they taking it in? Well, we do want to clarify, during a lot of that scuffle, the back and forth that we're hearing, they're not actually in the room. The jurors aren't. Now, you mentioned on November 19th, that's Friday. That was the initial date. That was the initial timeline that we thought this was going to wrap up, that the judge set. But obviously that is not the case. I did have a chance to speak with First Coast News legal analyst LaVonda Middleton about this, about the timeline. And she said it makes sense what the defense is possibly going to request today in their motion. They want more time to prepare, perhaps, and they want to give time for the motions in order to dispute certain things. And they don't want to rush the verdict. That is so important to hammer home. And they don't want to rush these people, because folks have it on their minds. I want to go enjoy the holidays and Thanksgiving with my family, but they want them to absorb the information, the evidence that they were given, and ultimately give a fair verdict.
Yeah, they've got a lot to work through. I mean, you've got 3 defendants. You have, I think there's 8 charges against, 8 or 9 charges against each of them that they're going to have to go through one by one. And that is a
Okay.
time-consuming process.
Nat, Ann Schindler, we appreciate your time. Folks, we're going to go ahead and turn things over into the courtroom right now because court is now resuming on day 9 of testimony. We are set to hear from the defense today. The state has rested. Thank you again, Ann.
You bet.